video of mine that you're going to get. It's the last week of class here with the Federalist Papers. I'm just going to briefly sort of overview the Federalist Papers, what they are, why they're important, but also some problems with the Federalist Papers. And then I just want to briefly touch on a couple of them, Federalist 10, 51, just sort of go over sort of the main ideas here. The Federalist Papers are a series of op-eds that are written in New York newspapers during the attempts to ratify the newly proposed Constitution, which will eventually become ratified and be the current Constitution that's in effect in the United States. We were operating under what was known as the Articles of Confederation, which was our first Constitution, which was bad. It was a giant mess. It was a terrible failure. It centered almost all political power in the states and created a very ineffective, disorganized central government that had no real power and authority to do much of anything. And things sort of began to get really bad in the various states and within the United States overall under the Articles of Confederation. And so a constitutional convention was called to attempt to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And essentially what happened at that meeting was the majority of people there decided that the Articles of Confederation was no longer a viable system of government, and we needed to not amend the Articles of Confederation, but adopt a whole new, different constitution. And so the new constitution is written, and then the constitution needs to be ratified by the citizens of the various states. And so there are contests in state by state to attempt to ratify, and New York is one of the major battlegrounds between the Federalists, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and to a lesser extent John Jay, amongst many others, who are advocating in favor of the new Constitution. And then you have anti-Federalists, people like Patrick Henry and George Mason, and a few others who are advocating against this new Constitution. And so there are a series of opinion pieces put into newspapers in New York arguing for citizens to either approve the new Constitution or reject it. Those essays in favor of the Constitution are what are today known as the Federalist Papers, because they're essays written by the Federalists, those who support the new Constitution. There's also the Anti-Federalist Papers, those essays that are written by the Anti-Federalists, those who opposed the Constitution. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are the two main authors of these Federalist Papers. John Jay wrote a couple, and then he sort of, with all group projects. There's always that one person who starts contributing, and then they go off and they don't contribute anymore, but they still get credit. That's John Jay. With Madison and Hamilton, we get their understandings of how the Constitution is supposed to work. But a word of caution here. Whenever we have debates about our system of government, how it ought to work, and the way it should work or shouldn't work, we tend to point back to the Federalist Papers. But we have to keep in mind the context with which the Federalist Papers were written. They're not an unbiased source, right? They are essentially propaganda pieces, right? They're pieces that are attempting to persuade people as to why the system is great. So there's nothing bad about the Constitution in any of these. No qualms, no pauses, no hesitation in supporting this Constitution, because they're attempting to persuade people that it's the thing we need. So it's not an unbiased source. And so from Madison, when you read the Federalist Papers, you need to be careful, because a lot of the things that Madison and Hamilton say in the Federalist Papers about why they're great haven't really happened. And if you ever get the chance to read the Anti-Federalist Papers, one of the things that's really important is a lot of the criticisms of the Anti-Federalists have actually proven to be true. Some of the criticisms of the Anti-Federalists were that we would establish a professional political class in this country, and that common people would not have great influence over politics, but a small elite would grow and govern and form the political class that would essentially permanently govern our country. And we do see some of that, right? We have members of Congress who have been in there 30 plus years, 40 years. Chuck Grassley, Senator from Iowa, is 90. He's been there a long time, longer than I've been alive. And we have, families that have produced multiple presidents and multiple generations of elected leaders, right? The Kennedys, the Bushes, the Roosevelts, the Adamses, the Tafts. And so there's a lot of criticisms from the Anti-Federalists that are valid. So if you ever get the chance, there's a wonderful book called What the Anti-Federalists Were For. That is a nice look at the Anti-Federalist Papers, which are underread. Now, that's not to say the Anti-Federalists are right about everything. In general, the Federalist Papers do present a very clear overview of our system of government. And again, just a word of caution that not everything that's in the Federalist Papers is like the Word of God, right? It's not divine revelation. They're opinion pieces. They're propaganda. So just be aware that everything in the Federalist Papers should be taken with a grain of salt. Okay? Another thing that's important when you look at the Federalist Papers is who wrote which one. So you have a number of Federalist Papers here. Hamilton, Madison write almost all the Federalist Papers, but they write them separately. And one of the things, when we have debates in our country about the Constitution, what it says, people always say, well, the authors of the Constitution, they meant this, or the founders of the country, they meant that, right? They were very clear. Hopefully, when you read these Federalist Papers, you come to realize that when you read Madison and when you read Hamilton, it sounds like they're talking about two very different constitutions. Madison and Hamilton have two very fundamental, different understandings about how this Constitution works. Okay? So, just an example. So in Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, both written by James Madison, James Madison is attempting to persuade the people of New York that the Constitution is a limiting document. And what he means by that is that the Constitution limits the power of the national government. And there are various ways that the Constitution will limit the power of the national government. And in Federalist 51, Madison is very clear. Right, so we've got separation of powers. Right, power is not concentrated in one area, but it's spread out. We have checks and balances. Right, various branches of our government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, they can act as a check on each other. They can stop one branch from doing something that may be unconstitutional or unwise. We also have federalism. Right, that states have power in this system, and states can act as a check on the national government. And he also says we have a principle of limited government, that there are only specific things that the Constitution enables the government to do, and the government cannot operate outside of those limited powers given to it. And in Federalist 51, Madison is making the argument that the national government is relatively constrained, right? It's constrained in its ability to act. It doesn't have the free ability to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. And in Federalist 10, right, Madison says the principle of representative government will ensure that tyranny never emerges, right? We're not going to have a direct democracy, right? We're not going to directly elect every part of the government. And we're not going to allow citizens to vote directly on laws. Citizens may elect representatives. And in doing so, representatives will take the will of the people and they will attempt to discern how we can generate a common good out of that. And we will elect the best and the brightest who will be able to discern what the public wants and how to translate that into some sort of common understanding for each other. And in doing so, we will have a government that is reserved, and we will have a government that does not act on whims, that will act on reason and logic, and will not give in to the passions of the mobs, right? Factions, right? They are the enemies of democracy. These groups of people who want to seize government, take control of government, and impose their will upon everyone else. He says our government will prevent that from happening. And so we're going to control the ability of mobs to take control of our government. We are going to limit the power of the national government. We're going to limit the power of the people to get what they want over what's in the interest of the country. Right? To hear Madison talk about this sounds wonderful. Hamilton gives us a very different understanding of the Constitution. Hamilton does not see a government that is constrained. Hamilton, when he writes about the Constitution, sees the Constitution as an enabling document. It is a document that enables the federal government to exercise broad, unchecked power. Because Madison and Hamilton both agree on one thing, that the Articles of Confederation suck and that states have too much power. So we need to give more power to a national government. Where they fundamentally differ is how much power that national government has. They both believe it should be stronger than the states, but Madison believes that national government is constrained in its ability to act. It is limited in its powers. Hamilton does not believe that to be true in the Federalist Papers that he writes. In order to stop reckless state governments that have endangered us, Hamilton says, what we need is a very strong, vigorous central government with the ability to act swiftly and decisively when needed. That government should not be constrained, right? That the federal government should have all the tools at its disposal to deal with whatever problems arises whenever it needs to. When Hamilton writes about the powers of the president, he essentially says we need an elected monarch. Government is not limited. National government has broad discretion, right? So the Constitution is not a document that restricts government. It's a document that gives government broad, expansive power and authority over almost every single sphere you could think of. That government is not constrained. Government is empowered to act. So whenever someone talks to you about the Constitution, they say, well, the founders said this, the founders said that. Ask them which one they're talking about. Is it Madison or is it Hamilton? Because they can't agree on what the Constitution means. And this will ultimately be the reason why we end up with our first political parties. Hamilton will lead a political party known as the Federalist Party, different from the people who wrote the Federalist Papers. Right? And then Madison will start a political party called the Democrat Republicans. And the main source of disagreement between these two parties is how much power the national government has. Right? And so for the early part of our country, these two political parties are debating how much power the national government has. And in the end, right, when push comes to shove, George Washington, our first president, fills his cabinet with almost exclusively members of the Federalist Party. He packs the Supreme Court with members of the Federalist Party. And Madison's conception of a very limited government loses. Hamilton's conception of a very strong, vigorous executive, very strong, unchecked national government becomes the mode of how this government acts. Now, you may disagree with Hamilton, but the fact remains that when push came to shove in the early parts of this country, Hamilton's vision for the Constitution is what won. Right? It is not a government that is constrained by a constitution. It is a government that has vast powers that are relatively unchecked. Okay? So hopefully you see that when you read these Federalist Papers. And if you want to learn more, I would encourage you to read more. I would encourage you to pick up some secondary documents about the Federalist Papers. I would definitely encourage you to read the Anti-Federalists, who have a lot of criticisms of what the Federalists write here. But it's a really fascinating time period of American history and very, these debates. There are a wonderful book called I think it's called The Other Federalists, right? There are other Federalists who are writing other things that also are in disagreement to Madison and Hamilton. So there are a variety of perceptions amongst the authors of the Constitution as to what the Constitution meant. And I would encourage you to read those because it's really important to understand that, and it also will make you a better citizen.